It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Tromsø. I've had the privilege of having many friends across Norway, but particularly in Oslo and Trondheim. And so it's very nice to open up, I hope, a new chapter of friendship and good relations here in Tromsø. What I want to do today is to talk a little bit about a vision for the future and the relation that health and medicine has to that vision for the future. It's a vision that has many challenges, many predicaments, and many uncertainties. But what I want to try and convince you of is that we have in universities like this, faculties like this, institutions like this, a great opportunity to rewrite a contract between ourselves and society. So let's start. Let's begin with a skull. It's been a long time since I did anatomy, but the skull is in many ways one of the most beautiful objects that one will find in the human body. I don't believe in intelligent design, but it is beautifully designed for the function that it served. And of course, over the millions of years that evolution has worked its power over our species, the skull has evolved to serve some of the critical functions of what it is to be a human being in terms of our basic bodily functions, of eating and sensing, carrying our brain, our consciousness. But it wasn't always like that. Just a year or so ago, a very different skull was discovered in Georgia. This is the most complete hominid skull that exists. It is dated from about 1.8 million years ago, a very early form of Homo. And you can see immediately the differences between this skull of 1.8 million years ago and the skull I showed you a moment ago. First of all, the cranial capacity is considerably less. The structure of the jawbone is considerably different, more protuberant, to take the origin and insertion of much thicker, stronger masticatory muscles. Overall, the face is much coarser compared with the picture I showed you immediately before. And so when we think about the transition from one skull 1.8 million years ago to the skull that we recognize and know today, that is a remarkable change. What does that signify? What is the meaning of that change? Well, Charles Darwin, of course, put it very well in Origin of Species. It's a story we are very familiar with. I think I found out the simple way by which species become exquisitely adapted to various ends. And that idea of adaptation, mutation, natural selection, is of course ingrained in the most basic biological tenets that we learn as students. But if you read Darwin's letters, you will discover a very different vision for what evolution was about. It's a vision that you will not find in the official text of Origin of Species. And this is what Darwin said: man in the distant future will be a far more perfect creature than he now is. In other words, the forces of evolution had a very clear trajectory, and that trajectory was towards an idea of perfection. That you and I are constantly progressing. We are getting ever more perfect. We are inexorably getting better and better. You are better than your parents, and your children will be better than you, and this is a continuous process. It's evolution. Now, at various times in history, there have been others who have taken a slightly more skeptical vision of the direction of travel of our species. John Milton is a poet who is not on every medical school curriculum, but I would submit that perhaps he should be. What John Milton wrote, of course, his famous text was Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is a story of temptation and disobedience, and what happens when we are tempted and disobey. And what he wrote in Book 2 of Paradise Lost was this very arresting vision. And fast by hanging in a golden chain, this pendant world. Let us just for a moment pause and reflect on that idea of a pendant world. When we think of the world, we think of our planet, which is big, robust, rocky, firm underfoot, very solid, and very much here with us. But the Miltonian vision of the planet was something very different. It was a planet that was hung by this golden chain in the cosmos, surrounded by infinite darkness, very alone, very vulnerable, exceptionally fragile. So whose cosmology do you prefer? Do you prefer the Darwinian vision of perfection, or do you prefer the Miltonian vision of fragility and vulnerability? And in many ways, that is the choice that we are faced with today. Writing a decade ago, Martin Rees, who was president of the United Kingdom's Royal Society, not a maverick scientist, not a crazy millennialist, wrote this: "I think the odds are no better than 50-50 that our present civilization will survive to the end of the present century." Can that be true? Can it really be true that at the toss of a coin could tell us one way or the other whether we are going to have our present civilization till the end of this century or not? I see the youngest member of the audience at the back in a pushchair. What is going to be the future for him or her? Her. What is the future going to be for her at the end of this century? Well, according to Martin Rees, it's 50-50, friends. Is that right? Well, we have reason to be anxious. Just a few days ago, the number of deaths from Ebola in 3 countries in West Africa just tipped over the 10,000 mark. Almost certainly an underestimate. This month, we are now in the 5th year of civil conflict in Syria. An entire country, a civilization, an ancient civilization, almost completely destroyed. And if you read Johan Rockstrom's work from the Stockholm Resilience Center, one can get a sense of how the human species lives within a safe operating space on our planet, and there are various threats that face us in that safe operating space, from climate change to ozone depletion to aerosol loading of the atmosphere to acidified oceans to changes in the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles to the use of freshwater land systems and the slow erosion of our biosphere. All of these threats make Martin Rees's anxiety potentially true. What does this tell us about us on this planet? The way we present the threats to our species and the biosphere is entirely mistaken. The way we usually present these threats is to think of the threats as physical, outside of us. The threat is rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide, or acidified oceans, or loss of the biosphere, or disease epidemics, or growth in population. Wrong, wrong, wrong. The threats that we face are from us, from the human systems that we create to address or deal with these threats. The nature of our civilizations, how we construct our economies, our political systems, how we achieve social stability and how we create systems for peaceful dialogue between peoples and nations. That is the threat. The threat are human systems, not the physical entities around us. It is those human systems that are going to determine the sustainability of our species on this planet and the resilience to threats that we face. Now, those human systems, let's be very clear, have been enormously powerful and successful for some of us. Last year, Angus Deaton, an economist at Princeton University, wrote a book which I, again, would strongly encourage you to dip into. He entitled it The Great Escape. The idea that just within the last 250 years has been the inflection point for a small proportion of our species to escape from the almost pervasive level of deprivation and poverty that many people on the planet have existed in. Humanity's escape from death and deprivation began around 250 years ago. And when you look just in the space of 2 decades, you get a sense of how successful our human systems have been. So here in 1990, just over 3 billion people living in low-income settings, but here, 2011, that figure has now dropped below 1 billion. We've taken over 2 billion people out of extreme poverty within 1 generation. That is a remarkable achievement that our species has succeeded in. Translate that into health terms. This is a measure of years of life lost from 1990 to 2013. And again, what one can see is that years of life lost for various causes overall has been going down. So these are measurable advances in a metric of health, reflecting a very concrete advance in terms of our taking billions of people out of extreme poverty. And it's this kind of success that has led a group of economists and health professionals to talk about the idea of Global Health 2035. And this is a commission report we published at the end of 2013, and the essential idea in Global Health 2035 is that we can eliminate preventable mortality. We have the knowledge to be able to eliminate preventable mortality from infectious diseases and maternal and child health causes of death within 1 generation. And they call this a grand convergence. So Angus Deaton talked about a divergence over the past 250 years of this very small but economically successful part of the human family. And now we're talking about a great convergence, that we can bring people together and eliminate that inequity within 1 generation. And this schematically shown for countries with the highest child mortality, the lowest child mortality, and over the space of a generation, bringing those 2 lines together. Why is this important, this kind of story of success? Because giving this message to decision makers, policy makers, can unlock resources that can then be invested in health and human well-being. This slide is a picture I took last year in Toronto when Prime Minister Stephen Harper committed $3.6 billion to women's and children's health. Why did he commit $3.6 billion? One of the most conservative right-wing prime ministers on the planet is giving away a check of $3.6 billion in international aid. Unheard of. But why did he do it? He did it because he had the confidence in knowing that that investment would produce a measurable return within a very short number of years, a political cycle. And that is because we have a great story to tell about the success that we have built. And because of that success, We now look forward over the next 15 years. And in September this year, countries from 194 nations will come together to sign up to the Sustainable Development Goals. And these goals represent a vision of a realistic utopia. They are built upon the Millennium Development Goals, the idea that we're going to end poverty, end hunger, ensure healthy lives, ensure education, and achieve gender equality. Those have been the commitments for the past 15 years of the MDGs. And now as we look forward from 2016 to 2030, we're going to expand that vision still further. We're now going to look at creating an opportunity for sustainable water and sanitation, sustainable energy, economic growth, industrialization, getting rid of inequality, sustainable cities, sustainable consumption and production, solving climate change, saving our oceans, saving our ecosystems, and creating world peace. It's a great vision, and it's a vision I definitely want to sign up to. Can we achieve it? Well, if you can count, there are 16 there, and there is a 17th Sustainable Development Goal. And in some ways, it's the most important, because the 17th goal is this: to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. What does that mean? That's UN speak for saying you put your words into actions. So how are we going to do that? There is a target for health. So what do we have to achieve over the next 15 years? And the target for health is going to be something like this. It's not yet finally written, but it's something like this, that we can avoid 40% of premature deaths by 2030, and that means eliminating 2/3 of preventable child and maternal deaths, 2/3 of deaths from major infectious diseases, and even 1/3 of deaths from non-communicable diseases and other deaths and injuries. And of course, part of this is to extend access to cost-effective, affordable treatment. What that means is the great goal of universal health coverage. The fantastic idea that every single person on the planet, as close as we can get, has affordable access to a basic package of health services. So we have 100% of the population covered, 100% of the population protected from financial risk, and that we slowly increase the number of interventions that are available, maybe not getting to 100%, but certainly getting above that basic package. So this is the vision that we can share together for the next 15 years. There's a problem with this vision, because it's a very, very inspiring idea. But it's an inspiring idea that's based on the assumption that it's business as usual in every other aspect of our life. And that is wrong. If you go back and read this paper by Nobel laureate Amartya Sen and his colleague Sudhir Anand, they tell a very different story of the meaning of sustainability, because this is something we as a society have yet to confront. What does the word sustainability really mean? It does not mean business as usual. It means it's about all of us on the planet, not just some of us. And it means that we have to pay attention to the future generations as much as to our generation. But it means something even more fundamental than that. And that's why this paper by two economists is so important. The idea that we can continue with the goal of maximum economic growth, which certainly my country in the United Kingdom and most other Western countries espouse, that our goal is maximum growth. If we pursue that objective, that is not sustainable. And what the economics tells us is that if we really want to achieve sustainability, we are going to have to make trade-offs and not go for maximum economic growth, but to go for sustainable, inclusive growth that will be less than maximal. What that means is a conversation in our society that we've yet to have. We've yet to have that debate where we say we are not going to go for maximum growth, we're not going to go for maximum wealth creation, we're going to go for something less than that in order to sustain our societies, our civilizations, and indeed our existence on this planet. Why don't we have that debate? Because it's a very difficult debate to have. But make no mistake, it's a debate that we must confront at some point in the next 15 years if we are truly to grasp the threat to sustainability. Already, in parts of the world, this threat is very real. Writing last year in a series on the Arab world, Abbas Al-Zain wrote this: "We argue that the current discourse on health, population and development has largely failed to convey a sense of the urgency when the survival of whole communities is at stake. There are now many parts of the world which are not just trying to advance in conventional notions of development, but are simply struggling to survive." When you look at a country like Bangladesh, which achieved universal health coverage some years ago, and despite many political challenges, has done incredibly well in terms of its health goals, making dramatic reductions in child mortality, in extending affordable health services through a vibrant non-governmental organisation sector to a large proportion of its population. But the entire nation faces threats to its survival. If you look at disaster-prone regions, almost a third of the whole southern area of Bangladesh is at risk of cyclone damage and regularly is affected by cyclone damage. And a whole central area here in Bangladesh is permanently under threat of flooding. So these successes that we are seeing being achieved thanks to a policy of maximum economic growth are put in jeopardy because a consequence of that growth is creating the conditions for societal, civilizational collapse. Take China. China has seen enormous success, taking 400 million people out of poverty within the last 20 years, and very much on a trajectory to achieve universal health coverage. But if you look at China, not only are there very large disparities between the west and the east of China, what these little purple bars represent is the growth in the urban population. What we're seeing is such rapid urban growth that, together with other risks, in particular, for example, tobacco smoking, we are seeing the building up of a collection of risk factors that make the sustainability of China's great economic and welfare successes in acute jeopardy over the next 15 or 20 years. What I'm trying to convey here is the fragility of the success that we've achieved. So we have two choices. Again, it comes back to Darwin versus Milton. And if you look at the social science of the history of human civilizations, the patterns are very, very clear. We start off in a position of risk, and the preconditions for societal collapse are these: corruption, incompetent government, insecurity, degradation of our resources, poverty, and conflict and invasion, all of which can cause economic decline. And we know that in many parts of the world today, that is a reality. We have more conflicts in the world today now than we've had at any time since the end of the Second World War. And that economic decline will lead, if it's not addressed, to economic crisis. And then we have two choices. One choice is that we fail to recognize this threat and we move to a position of instability with early breakdown in our society. conflict, and when I say privatization, what I mean by that is we give up on the idea of creating public goods in our society. The idea that we have a commons that we need to invest in and protect for our communities. Disease, decline, depopulation. That then very quickly, if we don't address it, will lead to collapse, breakdown, fracture, civil war, social chaos, famine, and fragmentation. And there are countless examples of civilizations that have been born, have grown, been incredibly successful as cultures, but have then gone into this pattern of decline, crisis, instability, and collapse. It does not have to be like that. The alternative is this, that we recognize the threat and we respond by stabilizing our societies in the face of this threat. We have vision and the ability to see where we need to go and to take the tough decisions to address that different trajectory. That we believe in ourselves and believe in solidarity and build communities based on solidarity. And that we're willing to think about transformational actions to take us out of these crisis and decline moments. And then it's about reconstruction, reconstituting our society, recovery, building a new cultural memory based upon solidarity, and new beliefs based on a different vision for how we want to live in the future. Some of the most fundamental values in our society about how we want to live one with another. There's a particular danger that we face, and that danger is the intersection between inequality and environmental collapse. And right now, we are doing almost nothing on the planet to address that dangerous intersection. This is work done by Safo Motasharii and colleagues in NASA-sponsored research, which looked at different models for our future over the next 500 years. And remember that the history of civilizations doesn't work in decadal time intervals. It works over centuries. This is why we need to have the long view about where we are going. And what we see if we pursue policies of maximum economic growth is a gradual denaturing of our environment. Our ability to have a sustainable ecosystem will slowly be eroded. And we're seeing that today. That's work of Johan Rockstrom and many others has shown that we are moving out of our safe operating space. And at some point, our natural resources will fall below the carrying capacity of the planet. At the same time, we're pursuing a policy of maximum growth, and we are getting richer. This country is getting richer, unbelievably richer. And so we don't notice on a daily basis in our daily lives that we're destroying our natural resources. Who is going to be hit first by this gradual destruction of our environment? It's not going to be us, and this is where inequality becomes so important. The first people who are going to be hit by this time bomb are going to be people who are already living in precarious parts of the world, living in extreme poverty. Here, Safo Motasharii calls them commoners. And they are going to be the ones who suffer first. But we are going to be protected, relatively protected by our wealth. But at some point, even us, the elites on this planet, are going to be hit. And by the time it hits us, in maybe 350 or 400 years' time, it'll be too late. We will have crossed the safe operating space of some of these threats that we face. And we will not be able to go back. How do we address these threats? And this is where universities become so important. A few years ago, I sat down with Olli Petter Ottosson, who's rector of University of Oslo, and we talked about these threats, and we asked ourselves, what could a university contribute to thinking about these threats and the organization of our societal response to these threats. And with others across the university, he put together this commission on global governance for health, looking at the political origins of health inequity and prospects for change. And the case that they made in this commission is that we are very good at identifying biological risk factors, population-based risk factors, but we're very bad at addressing the political determinants of health. And one of the conclusions that came out of this commission was the idea that we can no longer wait for them, the political classes, to address these threats. That we have to organize ourselves to be the monitoring mechanism for many of these threats that face us on the planet. And the idea is that we've based a lot of our hope on relying on WHO and multilateral organizations to, in a sense, be the guardians of our future. But these organizations are not delivering in the way we would hope. Instead, we need to create our own platform to monitor the health effects of existing policy responses. And that means looking at issues around rights, trade, work, food, finance, humanitarian agencies, and others, monitoring what they're doing, tracking progress or tracking failure, and then reporting on that and taking those findings to policymakers. I wish I could say we didn't have to do this. I wish I could say that we could rely upon our multilateral agencies. I'm a huge, huge, huge supporter of the idea of nations working together to solve common problems. This notion of multilateralism is such a powerful idea. But sadly, even though WHO, when you walk into headquarters in Geneva, this big chart faces you. And although it's talked about reform to address the challenges it faces, the fact is that WHO and multilateralism is failing and failing badly. The mechanisms that our multilateral organizations have to address the threats that we face are through the World Health Assembly, countries coming together, writing resolutions, and agreeing about what to do. And here's one from just January this year. Look, Ebola, ending the current outbreak, strengthening global preparedness, ensuring WHO capacity. This is nonsense rhetoric. Because the reality is that while nation states are coming together with WHO to tell one story about what they are going to do with Ebola, what is the real story? Helen Clark pointed it out several years ago. A future potential Secretary General of the UN, currently head of UNDP, when she talked about paralysis, minimal outcomes, or failure within our global governance. Just a few days ago, Maria Chen and colleagues from Associated Press reported on documents that they had unearthed, finding that WHO, although it knew about the threat that Ebola faced to Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, it refused, consciously, deliberately refused to act, because it did not want to walk into what it thought would be a challenging political space. It wanted to avoid the political determinants of health, with the result that not only have 10,000 people died, but these three countries have seen their health systems and economies set back by at least 1 or 2 generations. And then just on Monday this week, Médecins Sans Frontières published their report entitled Push to the Limit and Beyond, because they also raised the alarm over Ebola, and they concluded that WHO and governments were literally party to a global coalition of inaction, a lack of political will, lack of expertise, or simply fear, they asked. So our existing arrangements for global governance are not working. And that's where we have to seize the opportunity to do a better job. And what that means is not just us in a university or at a journal, it means creating new coalitions for action. Let me take one example in women's and children's health that's been built up over the last decade, where we've worked with multilateral agencies but gone beyond them. We've worked with universities, we've worked with agencies, universities, NGOs, government departments for international development, aid organizations, charities, even a journal here or there. The idea being that we need to create new partnerships to address new challenges in our society. This is where universities become so critically important, and here's my question to you. What can you at this university do to come together to address these challenges? I look across this great campus here, and I see many different faculties, many different departments. I see people being awarded honorary degrees today from environmental sciences to working with the Sami population here in the north of Norway. What can we do together across a university? Some universities are already thinking about this. This is University College London, thinking about how it can mobilize its entire campus to address global threats. And they've looked at what they have comparative advantages in. Global health, sustainable cities, intercultural interaction, and human well-being are the four that they've identified that they can make a very particular contribution to. So what are yours? What are the University of Tromsø's comparative advantages? What can you do that Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, wherever cannot do? What is your unique contribution to this conversation? Working with UCL, we worked with this guy who's a professor of child health, Anthony Costello, and he led a project looking at the impact of climate change on health. And they made this big claim that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. You don't have to be an expert in the area to write that, but you have to be able to convene other experts who can bring together their knowledge and ignite that flame across disciplines to create this opportunity. We tried to make the argument not just for public health or global health, but for what we've called planetary health, that we need an urgent transformation in our values and our practices based on the recognition of our interdependence as human beings within a species and the interconnectedness of the risks we face. And we've tried to work together with colleagues, again, in the academic sector, on a commission on planetary health, like the Commission on Climate Change we did, and this is from a meeting in January in New York at the Rockefeller Foundation of the commission, chaired by that person there, who you can't see, but he's Andy Haynes, formerly director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. In thinking about this great divergence over the last 250 years, the risks of transformation of the world's natural systems, the challenge from human systems, and what we now need to do. This is a picture that my English father took 6 months after the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. The bomb was dropped August the 6th, 1945, and he went in early 1946 as part of what was called then, I think still called, the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. He was an engineer and went there to build bridges and re-establish communication networks there. He took 3 photographs, and these 3 photographs have been digitally put together, so you can see here. This picture, a big version of this picture, hangs over the fireplace in our living room at home. Rather depressing, you might think. But it's a reminder of the power of human activity when put to very nefarious ends. And it's an important reminder for me, a haunting reminder in some ways, about the importance of human systems and getting it right and thinking about how we protect our civilizations. And it's interesting that the proposal that has been made for the definition of the Anthropocene era, the era of human activity having a dominant part to play in shaping of the planet's future, has currently been dated as the 16th of July 1945, which is actually the date when the very first atomic bomb test took place. The Anthropocene era may well come to be defined by the use of atomic weapons. How can we prevent humanitarian disasters like this from happening in the future? And this is where it comes to the title of the talk. Because in Paradise Lost, John Milton wrote these very powerful words that are a reminder to us all. See with what heat these dogs of hell advance to waste and havoc yonder world, which I so fair and good created, and had still kept in that state, had not the folly of man let in these wasteful furies. Even when I say that out loud now, I can feel the hairs on the back of my neck just ticking up, because I find those words so frightening, that our future does rest with us, that these threats that we face, the dogs of hell, depend on our ability to avoid the follies that I'm afraid we have fallen into before. And this is why we have this opportunity. And let me come back to Amartya Sen one more time, because in his book, The Idea of Justice in 2010, he wrote this, and when he talks about the media, he also means you and I working together, researching together, studying together, writing together, advocating together. And he said this: an active and energetic media can play an important part in making the problems, predicaments, and humanity of certain groups more understood by other groups. And that is what we can achieve. It's the prize that sits before us that we can seize if we choose to seize it. Because if we don't choose to seize it, nobody else will. And it's the greatest opportunity we have for our sustainable and resilient future. Thank you.